The Conquer Worry Show, episode number 12.
This show is not to be considered medical advice. The contents of the show are for informational purposes only. Nothing should be considered or used as a substitute for professional medical or mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. If you are struggling, please seek professional medical assistance and call 911 if there is an emergency. Global hotlines can be found on conquerworry.org.
Welcome to the Conquer Worry Show, the show dedicated to creating awareness of the resources that are available to those who struggle with worry, anxiety, or depression. If you are struggling now, if you have struggled in the past, or if someone you love is struggling, this is the show for you. Joining us for another episode of the Conquer Worry Show. I am your host, Jay Coulter. I am not a psychiatrist, a psychologist, a counselor, or a social worker. Just someone who's struggled in the past with crippling anxiety and depression, and now I work as a mental health advocate to create awareness of the resources that are out there for people who are struggling. On today's episode of the Conquer Worry Show, we're going to play an interview we conducted with Jonathan Rottenberg. Jonathan is a professor of psychology at the University of South Florida, and he's recently published a book called The Depths, The Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic. And if you've been listening to the Conquer Worry Show, you know that it is an epidemic. But before we play the interview, just a couple of housekeeping items. First, if you haven't had a chance to go into the iTunes directory and rate the Conquer Worry Show, it'd be an enormous help to the program and help us increase the reach to help more people if you could get in there, rate us, hopefully with 5 stars, and write a little review. Secondly, if you haven't been to the conquerworry.org website lately, we have some new things out there. Stop by, take a look, see if you can find any resources on there that could help you or someone you love. And third, we are starting a Conquer Worry Ambassador program. We've already had requests from folks in Germany, Australia, in the United States who want to volunteer and be part of the message we're trying to get out there. If you're interested, head on over to conquerworry.org and send us an email. Tell us why you think you'd make a great ambassador for the Conquer Worry program. So let's get to our interview for this episode. John Rottenberg needs no introduction to anybody who has been following Conquer Worry on Twitter. His articles from Psychology Today are some of the most read and retweeted that we have. And his book, The Depths, The Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic, is sure to be a favorite amongst our followers. He was very generous with his time for this episode, so I'm just going to get right to it. Today I am excited to have John Rottenberg on the Conquer Worry Show. As a way of introduction, he is a leading researcher in the area of emotion and psychopathology, where he has focused on major depression. He is an associate professor of psychology at the University of South Florida. He's been published over 35 times in academic journals, and his new book is called The Depths, The Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic. John, welcome to the Conquer Worry Show.
Thanks for having me, Jay.
Sure. Hey, let's start with your background. And obviously you have a distinguished professional background. Tell us a little bit about your struggles with depression.
Sure. When I was a young man studying history in Baltimore, to get my doctorate, I became very depressed. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't know what depression was. I didn't know it could be something that would rule your life. And I had a very long journey both into and out of the episode. It lasted about 4 years. It very much changed my entire view of the world. By the time I was pulling out of the episode, I realized that the most important thing in the world, the thing that I needed to understand, was how moods can overpower us. And I decided to change fields. History no longer seems so relevant, and to study psychology. And that 20 years later has led me to this book that I've written.
4 years is a long time to be going in and out of it. Tell us a little bit about that time period. Did you know you were struggling? Were you seeking help?
No, it took me a long time. I didn't know what depression was, to be honest. And when my problems started, I had a lot of physical symptoms. I felt very weak. I couldn't get out of bed. I thought I had the flu. And when that didn't go away, I thought I might have mononucleosis or some kind of viral illness, because I had no energy whatsoever. I couldn't concentrate. I felt weak as a kitten. Ironically, my father was a physician, and I called him in great distress, and he naturally thought, "Oh, you might have a medical illness," and so I did see a doctor. I had a whole battery of tests. I had an MRI scan, and the good news and the bad news was that medically I was perfectly healthy. What was very terrifying about that was that I still felt just horrendous and confused and very frightened, because if there was nothing medically the matter with me, then what could explain why I couldn't get out of bed? And so it took quite a while before I became aware of the possibility, which was suggested to me, that it might have depression. I didn't know that depression could take that kind of form and be so completely overpowering. I mean, it wasn't like I felt I had no choice whatsoever in terms of being able to pull myself around, get up a flight of stairs. And I actually had a number of the other symptoms, but I didn't recognize it as such. I didn't feel sad. I didn't feel hopeless, at least not initially. It was really over time that it became more of a classic depressive presentation. When I say over time, over the first 6 months or so. And so, yes, I did get treatment, and I saw a number of psychiatrists. I got medications, fair number of different medications. I was inpatient for a month. I don't know if that was the worst point, but it was definitely a point in which I and my family were the most exhausted and kind of needed a break. I really wasn't in and out. I was really mostly in. And the crawling out of the depression was very slow and kind of a grinding process. But nevertheless, little by little, I did gain back my mind and my body. The part of that was with the transition, I think, to a new field and a number of other transitions in my life.
Okay, so tell us just briefly a little bit about that 1 month stay inpatient. What is that like for somebody who is struggling?
Well, it was less dramatic. I mean, it was a big step, in the sense that we all have stereotypes and many fears about a psychiatric hospital. This idea of one flew over the cuckoo's nest, and everyone is wearing restraints, and people are screaming. And I was on a very modern psych ward, and yes, there were some people who were very disturbed, but it was very specialized for people who had mood disorders. And so I met a number of people who were quite interesting, and in another context, I would have probably really enjoyed it. For me, nothing very dramatic happened when I was an inpatient. I got some new medications, and it was a change in my environment. For other people, they have a more dramatic response to being taken out of their normal environment. I think the big thing that was actually quite important was that it gave my wife a break, because being with someone who's severely depressed day in, day out, month in, month out is really exhausting. And I think that her sanity was starting to take a hit, and her morale was at a low point. And so this enabled her to get a break and then to look at me more intensively and try to figure out what else could be done.
John, this might be self-evident, but for somebody who is considering going for in-treatment help but is resisting for whatever reason, what advice would you give them to overcome that fear of going in?
Well, realize that now these sort of commitments, unless the person is at immediate risk for themselves, so they're immediately suicidal or homicidal, it is voluntary. So you're gonna get a long series of forms to sign. Do you understand this? Do you understand this? And so no one is being. I was a voluntary inpatient. Virtually every single person on the ward was there voluntarily, and so this is something that is supposed to help you. And involuntary commitment is another thing entirely. But most people, with a chronic depression like I had, they had exhausted a lot of the other options, the usual outpatient options, and so I would say to someone who might be frightened about this is that you need to be your own advocate, and sometimes you do need to go to the next step. I mean, in my case, in addition to inpatient treatment, one of the things that was put on the table was very frightening to me. I didn't end up doing was electroconvulsive therapy, commonly known as shock therapy. But again, in most cases, that is a voluntary. So, I would say get the information, talk with your psychologist or psychiatrist, talk with your family, and you get to be the person who ultimately is in charge of these decisions. And I think for a lot of people that is reassuring.
Sure. Well, that's good advice right there. I tell you, so when you were studying history, you found yourself in a place where you were depressed. You made some fundamental career changes and started studying psychology. Went on, obviously, to get your Ph.D. from Stanford. Now you run something called a mood and emotion laboratory at the University of South Florida. Could you tell our listeners a little bit about that program?
Sure. So in a lot of ways, what we're doing is very intuitive, and yet there aren't that many scientists doing it. So think of what depression is fundamentally, and depression has proven to be a tough nut to crack. At the core of that nut in the center is mood. Depression is a mood disorder. People who experience depression have moods that are low, that they describe as sad or empty for very long periods of time. What we're trying to understand in my lab is some of the dynamics that explain the long duration of these states, and what are the conditions. What if we actually run experiments in my lab where we expose people to different kinds of stimuli, so pictures and imagery and films and so forth, to try to understand how the experience of depression changes how people react to things, and actually it has a number of changes in emotional functioning. And we're also interested in what does that really tell us about depression. So can we predict who's going to become depressed? Can we predict who is going to stay depressed? Can we predict who's going to recover? We're studying this very fundamental aspect of depression. You'd think that everyone would be studying mood and emotion, but actually most of the science is on other aspects of depression, which is great. But I feel that more people should be sort of studying the thing that's at the center.
And so, what have some of your findings been?
Well, we're interested. One thing that I think we've really nailed down is that depression fundamentally involves diminished or less changes in appropriate reactivity to the environment. So if you went back in the science, and I don't know if this is going to sound arcane to some of your listeners, but in cognitive theories of depression, this idea that people have these kind of internal structures, the cognitive structures that guide their attention, guide their memory, and make them process negative information more intensively. The idea in cognitive theories was that depressed people should be really, really reactive to sad material because their attention is directed to sad material, their memory is directed to sad material, so they should react much more strongly to sad material than they do to neutral material. But what we found is actually the opposite, that depressed people react very much similarly to very different kinds of stimuli. So we have kind of changed a lot of people's opinions about fundamentally what's going on. And now we've gotten interested in why that is, what has changed inside the person that explains why, when put in different situations, depressed people tend to react the same way. And it sort of connects to a fundamental, experience that I had, and I think a lot of depressed people have, which is that they feel unmoored. They feel disconnected. It doesn't matter whether it's a beautiful sunset or rotting vegetables that they're looking at, that everything is sort of equally awful. And so I think that in many ways, while it challenged some ideas about what was going on, our view is in some ways pretty intuitive.
I can relate to that. When I was struggling, everything was dark, but I also found myself gravitating towards news, information, stories, and people that were dark themselves. Yeah,
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, it's we create an internal world. Healthy people do it too, but it can just be very dramatic in depression, that this internal world can kind of transform what's outside. So, for example, one of the things that happened when I was depressed was that I had a beautiful child. And all I could think was, looking at this beautiful child, how I wasn't ready. I wasn't ready to take care of this child. I didn't deserve this child. I was frightened. And yet other people look at that same stimulus and they say, wow, what a beautiful child. And of course, I could on some level acknowledge what a beautiful child and a lovely child too, a lovely baby. But this internal world very much takes over, and it alters how we perceive things. And that's one of the ways that depression perpetuates itself over time and can be so resistant to change.
If folks wanted to learn a little bit more about your laboratory, is there information on the university's website?
Absolutely. In fact, if you just type mood and emotion into Google or mood and emotion lab, maybe the first thing that pops up.
Great. We'll put that link in the show notes for this episode. Let's move on and talk about your new book, The Depths and Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic. Now, the Philadelphia Inquirer said, with tens of millions already on antidepressants, the expense will eventually force us to reevaluate our approach to care. The Depths is a first step. In Chapter 1, it's entitled, Why We Need a New Approach to Depression. John, why do we need a new approach to depression?
Well, what we're doing really isn't working very well at all. Just look at the raw numbers. Depression affects about 1 in 5 people in the United States. That's absolutely vast. It's not just faceless statistics. I mean, if you were to survey people in your life, depression affects our teachers, our doctors, our friends, our neighbors. Official bodies like the World Health Organization project that when we look into the future, depression is going to be a problem that grows, and that ultimately it's going to have a more negative impact than most of the most horrific and feared conditions like cancer or war or heart disease. Suicide kills about 30,000 people a year, and is, to me, astonishingly the second leading cause of death in young people. We've made all these major investments in both treatment and research, and I would argue, and I do argue in the depths, that it has not slowed the depression epidemic. In fact, if anything, depression seems to have as much or more momentum. And so I conclude that we need to start over. And so I present a new way of thinking about and talking about depression that's grounded in mood, in how we're put together or wired to have different kinds of moods, and that this ultimately is going to help us better understand and better contain the epidemic.
Tell us a little bit about that. How will it contain it?
Sure. So the goal is to focus on the core of depression, which is mood, and understand that the forces that are pulling people into depression and the factors that are enabling people to escape depression. And if we want to understand mood, the first thing we have to recognize is that we're beasts. We're animals just like other species, and we have this capacity for mood. Moods they're a product of evolution that ordinarily have been very helpful, helped our ancestors survive, and not just high moods. We think high moods are useful. Oh, high moods help us get rewards when they're available. We feel good, and so we move towards things that give us money, things that give us status, things that give us power. But low moods also tend to be useful, especially in situations that might be dangerous or situations where our behavior is not paying off. Low moods help us pause our behavior and reconsider what we're doing. And the problem is that low moods, while they're useful, like every adaptation, they're not perfect. So there's a lot of other adaptations. Think of anxiety, think of pain, where to have a capacity for pain is very useful. You don't get your tissues damaged. You ultimately you'll be more likely to survive. But the capacity for pain opens the door to having intractable chronic pain or pain disorders. So the same thing is true for mood. That what's happened is that our species has created a unique environment, a unique physical environment, a unique cultural environment that's very hospitable for low mood. So the environment that we're in is very different than the environment that we evolved in. There have been some very dramatic changes just in the last 10,000 years in our environment that's created this perfect storm for mood. And that's part of why depression is on the rise, and especially so recently.
So if somebody wanted to get better control of their moods and understand where they are, besides reading this book and looking into your work at the Mood and Emotion Laboratory, are there any exercises they could do or thought projects they could go through?
That's the good news, is that there's a tremendous amount that this approach opens up for what people can do. So, to continue the thought, part of why our contemporary environment is so bad is that many of the key ingredients for mood are missing. So, for example, we don't get enough sleep, we don't get enough light, we don't get enough physical activity, and these are all factors that are kind of breeding grounds for low mood. And so, in terms of things that many people immediately can look at as things that they can change, those would be three immediate things that people can start to experiment with. But in addition to that, another major factor that's leading people to be more depressed than ever has to do with how people react to their negative mood. So again, depression doesn't happen because human beings are uniquely defective, but in fact because of some unique capacities that we have, some things that humans do, in a sense, too well. So, we're the only species that has advanced language and the ability to tell stories about ourselves. So a chimpanzee can feel bad, but only a human being can feel bad about feeling bad. And so one thing that happens when humans get in low mood is that they then attach tremendous meaning to the mood. So they think the thought, this means I'm a terrible person, I'm a terrible mother. Chimpanzee can't do that. And so one thing that we're doing is that we're turning these thoughts over and over in our heads endlessly, or rumination. And that, too, is something that people can change. People can change how they're reacting to moods. They can change what their expectations are for mood. So one of the big problems that we have in our culture, again, one of the breeding grounds for low mood, is that we have extraordinary, I would say, unprecedented standards for happiness. Our culture is in many ways asking the impossible, which is to be happy all the time. We're not designed to be happy all the time. Evolution has wired us to try to be able to survive and to reproduce. And happiness is something that is meted out sparingly along the way. But nevertheless, people have this idea that others are feeling excited, feeling high, feeling euphoric a large percentage of the time. And that's just not true. Most people aren't. The problem is that people look out. They might go on social media, for example, and they come to the conclusion, I'm not as happy as I should be. And they think, what's wrong with me? And they start, again, getting in this kind of ruminative thought pattern. And they're thinking, what's wrong with me? Why isn't my mood better? And this is something that people can change. So people can learn to tolerate a certain amount of low mood, realize that it doesn't mean that you're diseased or defective. And in fact, what often happens when people do that is that it reduces the sway of low mood on them. So happiness is very ironic. It's a very ironic goal. It's very different than other goals. Like you might want to learn to play the piano. If you want to learn to play the piano, you can buy some books on how to play the piano. You can sit in front of the piano. You can practice, and by golly, generally speaking, you're going to get better. But wanting to be happier is not something that you can, if you work at it with the goal of being happy. Ironically, what often happens is that people are unhappier. Happiness is something that tends to happen when people are pursuing other meaningful goals. So to quote John Lennon, happiness is something that happens when we're busy making other plans. But in our culture, we've really become very fixated on feeling happy, feeling very, very high levels of happiness. And I think in many ways we're not designed to be that way. And this is part of what is leading people into trouble.
One of the foundations of the Conquer Worry program is to figure out what your life's purpose is and pursue it, because it's hard to get upset about other things if you're going after something with purpose. It sounds like what you're saying is that if you can learn to manage those challenging times when you're experiencing low mood, instead of having expectations that they're not going to be there, you end up with a happier experience. Is that correct?
It is, and I actually think that the premise behind your program is very profound. Because our model, our reigning model of mental health, the biomedical model, is essentially saying that people have defects, and we're trying to make those defects go away, whether the defects are in the brain or defects are in the genes or defects are in cognition. And then if we do that, then people will be fine. They'll have no symptoms. But that's actually not true, and it's a very impoverished way of thinking about mental health. If we replace it with the idea that what we want to create for people are meaningful lives within which they're flourishing and pursuing goals that are important to them, mental health is going to be an inevitable byproduct of that. And what will happen is that not only can someone who's experienced a horrible depression or a horrible anxiety return to where they were before, but they actually can come back stronger than they were before. Depression is actually something that can help people discover what their purpose in life was. Depression is incredibly destructive, but it can be a kind of creative destruction. And my book is more than about my own life, but I would hold out what happened to me as an example of someone who went through a destructive, terrifying experience, but emerged stronger and a little bit wiser about what my purpose on earth, or my purpose is on earth, are. And unfortunately, I think in our reigning model of mental health, that isn't something that gets too much play or consideration. I think it's really unfortunate.
That's great. So I tell you, when I was diagnosed with depression by my doctor, I told him he was wrong, and I left his office and went to the library, picked up every book they had on depression, went to the bookstore, went home, started reading, and of course found out I was depressed. What could somebody who finds themselves in that same place gain from picking up your book to learn about where they are and what they can do to get better?
Well, my book it's about two things. One thing that it's about is mood literacy. So more and more people are more and more depressed than ever before, but people are even more confused than ever before about their moods. In some ways, that's because we've been kind of taught to listen to Prozac and not to listen to mood itself. And so the book is really about all the different things that push around mood. And people can apply this. They can learn, in their case, what are the things that are most likely pushing around their own moods. Is it things like sleep? Is it things like light? Is it things like their physical activity? Is it how they're reacting to their moods? Is it the cognitions? Does it have to do with the people that they're surrounding with? that's part one, is understanding the different sources of mood. So the book is really designed to create a framework so people could better understand why they might have depression, or people in their among their loved ones would have depression. The other thing that I'm really hoping that comes out of the book, and this is part of the idea that we need to change how we think about depression, is that if we do that, we'll start talking about depression in a much healthier way, in a way that's helping to end society's profound ignorance about the condition. And it's also a way that's much more supportive of depressed people so they can get well and stay well. I think this idea that mood is a natural capacity that can be put in a bad place but can also be contained is the beginning of a broader dialogue about how we can create better conditions for people to recover, better conditions for people to stay well. I mean, I think your organization is very important in opening up conversation, confronting the stigma and the shame that unfortunately very much continue to surround depression and anxiety. I mean, I think that we have made some strides, but I'm also struck that you're asking me about the hospital and the process of going into the hospital. And when I went to the hospital, very few people knew that I was being hospitalized for depression. And I can't think of any other condition. I mean, I broken 2 legs or injured my spine, or I was having problems with my heart, that we wouldn't just say that that's why I was going to the hospital. But to have this sort of problem and to be unable to talk about it is, to me, is unacceptable. And so, to me, striking that despite it being 20 years later, I know that there is another young person in the exact same situation signing the papers to go into the hospital who's not really told very many people in their social network about their depression or their anxiety, in part because of the fear of how other people will react. People are still frightened about these conditions and what they mean. They think, oh, I'll never be able to get a job. People won't love me anymore. And I think we have so much room to improve the kind of dialogue, both the quantity and the quality of the dialogue. And I think the time is really right to do that. And so that's my 2 goals in the book: better understand the sources of mood, this idea of mood literacy, and have a much better dialogue about mood and mood disorders that ultimately I think is going to be necessary to reversing this horrible epidemic on a national and international level.
Yeah, I love your goal of trying to decrease some of the stigma that comes along with this. I had a similar experience where I didn't tell anybody for years because of the embarrassment and shame that went along with it. You know, I joke that if you're gay in America now and you come out of the closet, you're celebrated, as you should be. But if you have a mental illness, people might say, oh, that's okay, oh, poor you. But they don't really understand it unless they've been through it. But I tell you what I found from talking about it, that it falls about right in line with the statistics, John. About half the people say, hey, you know what, Jay? Either I've struggled with it, my spouse struggles with it, my cousin struggled with it, and everybody has a story, but nobody talks about it.
That's exactly right. But the thing is that what's happened with gay rights shows us that it's possible to change things, and change things in a surprisingly fast time scale. And one of the initiatives I'm involved with is something called the Come Out of the Dark campaign. And I have a student organization that's distributing wristbands that say "Come Out of the Dark" on them, and they're glow in the dark, and people think that they're cool and so forth. And I'm just amazed by how young people think that it's completely natural that if someone had depression or anxiety, that they should be able to talk about it. Older people, maybe not so much, but my hope is that just as younger people were absolutely critical in making gay rights, gay marriage, the idea you can love people and that it's legitimate and so forth, something that shifted the ground, that the same thing can happen with a variety of mental conditions, and that people can just be comfortable in their own skin. I don't think that the goal is that for 24 hours of the day we're talking about depression, anxiety, there's so many other things to life that are important and meaningful. But depression and anxiety are also important and meaningful to a lot of people. And the idea that you can't talk about these things, that you're somehow a leper, that you have to be in hiding, I don't accept. And the good news is that I think the change is on the way. It might be 5 or 10 years off, but I think there are going to be some pretty dramatic changes. Critically, I think what's going to happen in the employment context, because I think this is one of the real rubber hits the road, why people don't want it to be known if they've had struggles, is they feel that they won't be hired, or if they're hired, they won't be able to stay in their position. That, I think, is one of the most difficult. I think in some ways we can change what happens in our families, in our schools, in our communities probably faster than the kind of subtle discrimination that I think still happens in the employment context. But I think that ultimately it's going to happen, in part because it just makes sense. And there's a lot of evidence that these conditions can be managed, and that people ultimately are more likely to get effective help if they are able to identify the problem, if they're able to talk about the problem. It's not a cure-all, of course, but we have this terrible problem, for example, of suicide, and it's so often because the person people didn't recognize the conditions they had. If they got treatment, they didn't stay in treatment, and so often the reason for that is stigma, is fear, and so if we can reduce that, I think we can keep people happier, healthier, and prevent these tragic outcomes like suicide to a much greater extent.
John, you're doing fantastic work in the space. 4 takeaways for our listeners. Number 1, get some sleep. Number 2, get some light. Number 3, some physical activity. And number 4, go pick up John's book, The Depths, The Evolutionary Origins of the Depression Epidemic. It's on Amazon, and there'll be links in the show notes. John, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Jay. Thanks for attracting attention to this important issue.
All right. Good luck. I'm really grateful that John came on the show to talk about his book, the work he's doing on mood. But I tell you, we had a long talk after the interview, and he's really changed the way I'm thinking about stigma. I've always thought that the folks that are out there working hard to change the stigma of mental illness were doing great work, but something that would really take an incredibly long time to ever overcome. And he's actually got me thinking a little bit differently now. Maybe we can change the stigma for the next generation, because any type of large paradigm shift when it comes to stigmas typically happen with the youth. And he believes, and he's around young kids all day, is that generation below us, the kids coming up today, might have a different attitude towards mental health. I want to thank John for coming on the show. Again, please pick up a copy of his book, The Depths. There's a link in the show notes. And I want to thank you for listening to another episode of The Conquer Worry Show. As always, if you're struggling, please seek help. Then determine what your life's purpose is and live in relentless pursuit of that purpose.